Is Putin worse than Stalin in his treatment of his own people and his respect for human rights? I would argue no, he's not even close. Stalin is one of history's most heinous, most evil actors, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. Was Putin worse than Mao Zedong in the People's Republic of China, responsible for millions and millions of deaths of his own people? I would argue no. And yet the United States conducted diplomacy with Stalin. We were in fact allies with Stalin when it was in our national interest to do so. We conducted diplomacy with Mao Zedong. And so we reached agreements with Maoist China, with the Soviet Union for much of the Cold War, because it was in our national interest to do so, and it protected American national security. Now, did we trust either of those actors? No. Ronald Reagan used to cite what in fact was a Russian aphorism.
Doverye no proverye. Trust but verify.
You trust that they're going to live up to their own national interests, and you use national intelligence means to monitor compliance. It's how the Russians deal with us. That's how we dealt with the Russians and the Soviet Union for many, many years. You construct agreements that are in their interest as well as in ours, and you monitor. You use your intelligence means to make sure that you're not getting duped in all of this. And that worked relatively well during the Cold War. I think there's no reason to believe that it can't work today. Well, the question is, what rules-based order are you talking about, right?
The rules-based order.
Well, I don't think there's only one, and that's part of the reason why we have a conflict going on right now over Ukraine and elsewhere. During the aftermath of World War II, the victorious powers put in place the foundations of the world order, the UN Charter, Bretton Woods Accords that governed the economic discourse in the world. The Russians opted out of the economic order, but they were participants in the UN system. And on top of that, we reached understandings on rules of the game in Europe through the Helsinki Accords, which had a set of principles that everybody bought into. And the Russians, for the most part, have said, we're comfortable with that order. What we're not comfortable with is the post-Cold War order that emerged after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where the United States became the rule setter, the world's sole arbiter of how you apply rules, the decider on when it could exempt itself from those rules. And the Russians have said, wait a minute, we're not comfortable with that. We're not comfortable with a system in which the United States can decide when the rules don't apply to itself. The Russian position on this is, well, that's not a rules-based order. There are large parts of the world that say, yeah, we agree. We want something in which we have more of a voice that looks a lot more like the post-World War II system than the post-Cold War system that evolved. Those are things that we're going to have to address. The only way to address them, I think, is diplomatically, if you're not going to actually go to war. Ultimately, the world's leading powers are going to all have to buy in to the contours of the world order. If they don't buy in, then you don't have an order. I negotiated with the Russians on a lot of things: conventional arms control, approaches to the frozen conflicts in the former Soviet Union, the broader contours of Europe's security architecture. Many of the people that I was negotiating with back in the 1990s are in very senior positions today in the Russian Foreign Ministry in the Kremlin, in the Russian Ministry of Defense. They've certainly not forgotten their experiences from the 1990s. The Russians at that time were in a very weak negotiating position. They did not have a strong economy. They had lots of domestic, societal, and political problems at home. Their military was in disarray. And this meant that they had to make logical arguments. They tried to persuade the United States on the strength of their reasoning. In high-level, hardball negotiations, logic and evidence and reasoning only get you so far. It's leverage that really matters, and the Russians didn't have a lot of it. And I think they felt, as a result, that the United States simply walked over them. And I think that left them, to some degree, embittered. Putin is not a madman. He plays full contact politics, no question about it. He's playing hardball. But is he irrational? Is he someone that does things that make no sense, at least from the point of view of Russian national interests? I don't think that's true. The Russians say they want to come to the negotiating table. Putin has reiterated that many times. So one of the ways you get the Russians to the negotiating table, if you want to go there, is to call them on it. You say you want to talk, we're ready to talk. Let's meet, let's talk, let's discuss. Putin is then in the uncomfortable position of either disavowing his own rhetoric or making good on what he said he wants to do. We're not going to have an unconditional defeat of the world's largest nuclear power. Where we're heading is not towards some sort of stable division in Europe. We're probably headed toward a situation where Ukraine becomes an open wound, where Russia actually achieves much of what it's trying to on the battlefield. And then I think they'll dig in. And they will then ensure that Ukraine can't be rebuilt, that the refugees will not repatriate, that reconstruction projects really won't make substantial progress. Now, how can they do that? By keeping alive the possibility of missile and bomb attacks on the non-Russian occupied parts of Ukraine that will discourage investment, which will in turn prevent real economic growth, which will discourage refugees from returning, and will more or less turn Ukraine into either a failed state or some sort of dysfunctional ward of the West. And in the meantime, we're not going to put in place the rules of the game. We don't have diplomatic channels with Russia. We don't have understandings anymore about what's inbounds and what's out of bounds. And the likelihood that the West, NATO, and Russia get into some sort of new confrontation over other parts of Europe, the Balkans, Moldova, Belarus, Kaliningrad, is relatively high. This is a recipe for a volatile Europe and probably a renuclearized Europe. We're not going to have an unconditional defeat of the world's largest nuclear power. It simply won't happen, and to pursue it is too dangerous. So there's going to have to be a diplomatic settlement. Now, is it immoral to reach a diplomatic settlement with someone who is as guilty of aggression and war crimes as Putin is? I would argue that's the wrong question to ask. Is it a necessity that we do under these circumstances? Yes, I think it is. Ukraine has done an incredibly admirable job in defending itself against the Russian invasion. But you have to know when you've done all that you can and when it's time to consolidate those achievements rather than risk them in pursuit of a goal that's not achievable. Matching your objectives to your capabilities requires a strong sense of realism, of pragmatism. Kiev could be at Russia's mercy on the battlefield, and yet Russia could still not achieve some very important things that it needs to achieve. Russia doesn't have an army nearly big enough to occupy all of Ukrainian territory. They're still left with the problem of NATO and dealing with Russia's security against the NATO alliance. Winning, quote unquote, in Ukraine doesn't fix that problem. We can continue to make Russia's prospects on the battlefield painful. Providing aid to Ukraine to defend itself against the Russian invasion can be an important part of reaching a settlement in the war that makes everybody more secure. But we have to have that plan. Over the longer term, Russia's economic growth faces some real limits unless it can restore some sort of meaningful economic discourse with the West. They still need some understandings with the United States and with the NATO alliance about rules of the game, what's in bounds, what's out of bounds, arms control. So those are enormous incentives for the Russians to seek a negotiation with the West. There's probably not going to be a quote-unquote just end to this war. If we pursue justice at the expense of stability, at the expense of order, I think we're going to wind up with neither justice nor order. The conflict over Ukraine has a couple of different dimensions to it. One is a bilateral dimension between Ukraine and Russia over things like where the boundary line between those countries is going to be drawn, prisoner of war exchanges, economic discourse and trade, language and treatment of ethnic and cultural minorities. But then there's the broader relationship between Russia, the United States, and NATO. And that's an issue that the United States has to be involved in. Ukraine can't negotiate the nature of the relationship between NATO and Russia. It's a bigger issue than that. The broader context of arms control and the conventional military balance between NATO and Russia, confidence and security building measures between Russia and Western militaries, rules of the game of various kinds, all of those things have to be worked out. That's an important element of this conflict. That's something that the United States has to be involved in. Our NATO allies have a voice in all of this. And on top of that, the Ukrainians are calling for the Chinese to be one of the guarantors of whatever deal ultimately gets struck to end this war. If the Ukrainians want the Chinese in, the Chinese say they want to be involved, it's going to be pretty difficult for the United States to say no to that. So my guess is that the Chinese are going to have a role in this too.